All right, we have another panel, Beyond KYC, the real compliance barriers institutions face on-chain today. So I will pass it off to the moderator, Aisha Kiani, COO of Monarch Asset Management.
Great. We're going to get started, just to be mindful of everyone's time. This is actually my favorite topic in crypto. Part of the reason is because I'm the COO, CCO of Monarch Asset Management, and we've been in the liquid market space for about 9 years or so. And I've been at the fund for 7 years, and nothing makes me cry more than onboarding and KYC. And it is such a disaster to see that how we're like doing all the big talk, but when it comes to like the basic principle of onboarding someone, how it's a crying point. So I'm so glad that ETHDenver decided to have this of a point. We'll quickly do intros. I have some esteemed panelists here, and then we'll jump right into questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joshua Rivera. I'm one of the partners and the general counsel at Blockchain Capital. We're a venture capital firm. We invest in startups, specifically building in the crypto and blockchain industry. We've been doing it for about 13 years. I've been there for about 8. We manage now 11 funds and about 2.8 billion in assets, depending on what the price of digital assets are at any given point. I am delighted to be here next to 2 portfolio companies that we have recently invested in. I'm really here to just like display their greatness. They're the real experts. So I'll just be directing most questions to them. Be great.
Hey, I'm Nikhil, Raghuveera, co-founder and CEO of Predicate. Joshua, I think you sell yourself a little short there, given you're a general counsel and you've been in the space for a really long time and have had to deal with a lot of the policy questions around what we'll be talking about. But yeah, we build on-chain policy infrastructure. So our whole thing is around how do we abstract away the incredibly boring compliance things that RWA projects, privacy projects, stablecoins, regulated products. How do you abstract that away and have that enforced fully on-chain? And so there's a lot of different pieces to that, whether that's AML, anti-money laundering, KYC, KYB, identity, all these different facets. But really, we build infrastructure that is designed to abstract that all away while allowing all of this to be enforced on-chain.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chunda. I'm one of the co-founders of Paxos Labs, the newest initiative out of the Paxos ecosystem. At Labs, we focus on basically continuing the same vision that Paxos initially created, which was building enterprise crypto capabilities meant for global markets and for global scale. So we focus primarily on trying to answer a lot of questions around compliance and can we get some of the biggest enterprises around the world in many different jurisdictions comfortable with the idea of adopting on-chain technology and crypto capabilities directly within their platforms that they can go and then provide to their consumers. So a very close partner and client of the Predicate folks here. And it's been great to talk about this topic, which Nikhil and I spend a lot of time almost on a daily basis jamming about.
So I wanted to jump into it, right? So traditional KYC, right? The thing with crypto, it's global. You're dealing with multiple jurisdictions. You're dealing with multiple governing parties. You're dealing with multiple entities, even, whether you're Paxos, we're a fund based out of Cayman, the UBO sits all around the world. And every single time I had to explain my own compliance procedure to any of, the counterparty, it becomes a 70 to 80 email process. How does Onchain solve for that? And before it becomes more technical, one thing I am also very mindful that all of these Web3 companies use the Web2 technology. So how do you solve for that?
All right, so I think there's like a number of moving parts to your question. The first one is like, why can't I use my same identity that I've already done with one organization and reuse that in another one? And I think this is fundamentally where KYC and particularly KYB break down, right? Is because every organization, especially a regulated institution, is going to say that they have slightly different parameters or permutations of their KYB, as well as the fact is that they also want to validate and know that you have done it with them because they don't want to trust someone else. And I think that gets to the core aspect of there is no universal identity when it comes to regulated activity. That hasn't happened, right? And we've seen, crypto native identity solutions try to say, let's build a universal identity. But I think really it comes down to the fact that the requirements for different organizations really varies. There is no consensus on that. What you can have is you can have some data sharing between different groups. And I think that part is like really the best solution at the moment, but I don't want to come up here and preach that, there's another universal identity solution because this is not crypto is not the only group that has thought about universal identity. This has been going on for like at least the last 2 decades, well before crypto. I think the other part then to your question is, how does Onchain really allow you to do that? I don't think it does. I think it's actually that we want financial transaction to happen on chain, so how do you enforce KYC, KYB requirements is really it. That's, I think, where we're at. And I think that's going to be the V1. The long tail is a universal identity. And then your last question around like, a lot of the identity solutions still use Web 2, and I think it comes down to product, right? Like, if I go and use, the existing Web 2 identity solutions, the biggest ones are, SumSub, Persona, all of those. They have far more technology backing their entire system of having a more seamless process. Like, it's not just face verification and passport, right? It's ongoing AML checks. I noticed even in the last 6 months that SumSub improved their system significantly. I think they heavily used AI to reduce false positives and reduce the requirement for manual review. Like, we did an ICO last fall, and the manual reviews that we had from then versus like a subsequent one dropped by like, 60%. And so you can see that they're actually advancing on the back end a much faster, more product-oriented system compared to what we've seen in the more crypto-native identity solutions so far.
Yeah, one thing I'll add on top of that is it's good to understand like where the origin of the complexity comes from, right? Because it's pretty easy to kind of chalk up kind of identity complexity to jurisdictional complexity, but it also exists within jurisdictions. For example, the crypto exchange will have very different compliance requirements to onboarding with Paxos, right? And the reason is because different degrees of activity for consumers to enterprises to regulated versus a little bit more non-custodial activity will have differing degrees of compliance that are required by then that jurisdiction. So you get this ballooning amount of complexity where you not only have different compliance requirements on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, but you have differing degrees of compliance that are required within each jurisdiction. And so I think the really the only way to build solutions that are, I think, could attack the problem in a more, I'd say, realistic manner than requiring like universal ID or having some kind of internationally recognized universal ID is that ideally a lot of the enterprises that are building out their onboarding solutions into crypto try to work with regulators and standardize a similar framework on an enterprise by enterprise basis. So ideally, and then of course, build relationships with each other where you can share data. This is something that, we've done to some extent for some of our implementations where from an enterprise to enterprise basis, even if you are 2 different enterprises integrating, for example, let's say a lending solution, you're able to trust that we're using the same degree of compliance, and then we offer differing degrees based on platform. And then each of the enterprises, the N+1 enterprise, for that given degree of compliance can trust, okay, I at least understand that every single other enterprise that's implemented into the solution is basically faced with the same degree of rigor that I am facing when onboarding onto the solution, right? And so when you build out standards like that, either internally or across enterprises, then you can kind of ease this issue a little bit. But yeah, like Nikhil said, universal identity it's been a long problem that And unless we have a completely unipolar identity solution across all jurisdictions, I don't think we'll be there just quite yet.
Yeah, it's just like compliance is a spectrum, right? And so given that, you're going to have overlapping aspects across different organizations and different products and just different jurisdictions, but you have to navigate the fact that there is an entire spectrum across all of it.
Yeah, and so now that you two have displayed so eloquently why we invested in you, let me zoom out a little bit and give just a little bit of perspective on why building this infrastructure is so critical. We have created the crypto industry from a very different perspective from how kind of institutional compliance or any even individual compliance was created, right? Because all compliance over the course of history, right, all kind of transactions that are at scale over the course of history have happened via intermediaries. And so intermediation has been the centralized point for determining compliance with identity rules. We built crypto ecosystems to be disintermediated, right? And so in order to maintain that characteristic of disintermediation, which is so critical to the value of those ecosystems, what we have to do now to bridge traditional institutions that operate under a different paradigm, right? We have to create solutions that integrate into that disintermediation, but that are modular and programmable for their very specific, very varied type of compliance, as Nikhil and Chunda have just kind of expressed.
I wanted to add one thing to that. So first of all, the compliance part, right? Like on what you've invested in, the two of you. I think that crypto has the AML focus, and when I say AML, I mean by money laundering specifically, to the T, right? We have all of these service providers like chain analysis, TRM labs. You cannot miss one Bitcoin transaction to a dark pool, right? We have built that monitoring system perfectly. However, when it comes to the counterparty, that's where we kind of fail, right? Because that counterparty could have presented all kinds of documents, could have been verified whether on-chain or off-chain, and it's very hard to basically check out the legitimacy. So that brings me to my next point, which Shuna said on AML, right? Something we had to come across recently, and Joshua also touched it on a bit. We see our fund admin, right? They're running across, I think, 6 or 7 different lists, OFAC and whatnot, right? OFAC, the Asian list, and the sanction list. And a couple of weeks ago, an investor gets flagged because of a Chinese character. And I was like, what do you mean? And he, the fund admin is like, oh, they're labeled as a criminal in China and Taiwan. And I was like, how do you do that, right? Like, pull out the database, present it. The name was different in Chinese character and English character, right? And I went back to the fund admin, who's basically responsible for about 70 to 80 funds out there on labeling a perfect normal person as a criminal. Do you think we have an on-chain solution for that? Like, we have figured out for money laundering, yes, going back to the blocks, but how do we basically secure that identity?
I mean, I think it comes down to I think in this case, you actually need proper digital identity, right? I imagine in this case, this was flagged by, it's the same name as someone else, which always happens. And I think the solution in KYC, KYB world has historically been, all right, we need to do manual reviews here, and they need to send additional documentation, information. I think where this goes on crypto, and this is where it gets interesting, is more of your actual on-chain identities. I think there's an interesting overlap that hasn't happened yet, or a connection between ZK-TLS and on-chain identity. Like, take something like a world ID that you can have, or like a ZK passport, where you have your own sovereign identity, but then you should be able to start adding these markers and flags via ZK-TLS that is self-custodial, but is directly tied to specifically your identity. So that way, if you do need to have these other flags that do come up, it's something that's actually there already built in, right? And so it's those information flags that haven't happened yet. And I think that automation and that sourcing of data is something that blockchain is actually uniquely able to do, of pulling all these different pieces together.
Yeah, and I think it's easy for us to forget how layered identity is traditionally, right? Like you go through life with various forms of identity and identity verification, right? You have your birth certificate, you have your passport, you have your driver's license, right? And so when you need to get your identity verified, it's great. It's so much fun. You have to like go up in the attic, dig out your birth certificate, right? Like there's all these, and it depends on what you're doing it for, right? If it's to get a passport and you don't have a current passport, right? You have to, there are all these various touch points of identity. And so I think my personal prediction is I don't believe we're ever gonna have one universal identity, like natively digital identity. And, it'd be great if we had some disagreement on this panel, despite the fact that we're all friends. But, so maybe that's controversial. I don't know. Maybe I'll have to find something else to say that's controversial. But the way I see it happening is I think we're going to have identity checkpoints or identity kind of like data points or hashes, if you want to be technical about it, that utilize zk-TLS, other ZK technology, like what World is building or ZK Sync, or even other kind of oracles and touch points that span into kind of the real world, right? And so I think your identity is, what we're building pieces of a digital identity infrastructure that will all have to speak to each other and interact, so that when you have checkpoints, right, you're able to quickly kind of distinguish one character from another, because you're not actually looking at, a character list. You're actually looking at something that is much more tied to the person or to the institution.
Yeah, when you think about how this would be implemented in practice, especially with the concept of zk-TLS, like zk-TLS at its core is just a form of technology that allows you to create a secure and then ideally non-invasive way of attesting to arbitrary electronic information, right? Usually you're verifying some like WebSocket call. And because of that, you can imagine a future where, let's say this person gets flagged, right? Well, it's very easy for them to say, hey, like, let me go and I have this address that's tied to every single kind of unit of my online and personal identity. And it could be things like passports, driver's license, but it could also be things like, hey, like, here's my purchase history for the last 5 years on so-and-so app on Amazon, and every single like consumer app that I've ever purchased. And you can see within that the location data of where I am, what payment solutions I'm using, and then you can, because it's ZK, you can expose only the absolutely required information there. For example, you could say, hey, this person isn't making purchases in a sanctioned region. This person is actually mostly making purchases in this region of which they say that they were domiciled in, and not where this other person is domiciled in. And ideally, you can pull that information a lot quicker, so that way you're not having to do this awkward manual, really like lunky process of pulling out ancient documents and taking photos of them in good lighting to send to some verification system.
So we have about 3 minutes, 1 minute for each one of you. How far or how close we are into basically streamlining this maybe? Oh, I would solve my day. And Nikhil, I know, is considered an expert in this topic, like on identity, on-chain identity. So,
yeah, I mean, I think I think we're really far away, and hopefully my fellow panelists disagree with that. But our investing philosophy is we're really investing for a decade or more into the future, and right now we're building the foundations for the things that we're talking about. And we've been talking about it from a really technical perspective, from kind of a philosophical perspective in terms of how we bridge a traditional financial ecosystem to a kind of bleeding edge financial ecosystem. And I think an aspirational perspective, right? Like how should identity look in a world that is well integrated, right? And so I think it's gonna take time, because the way the ecosystem is developing, the industry is developing, is not in one line, right? You have all of these different types of protocols that are building things in different ways, and we need to integrate them over time. And so I think we're pretty far away, but I'm very optimistic that we'll get there.
I think we have to bucket kind of the different problems you're solving with identity, right? So proof of humanity, I think we're actually going to have that accelerated significantly in the next 2 years. I think when we talk about regulated activity of like KYC, KYB, I don't think we're going to fully solve it, but I would say in the next 3 to 5 years, a number of the pain points that you're facing will likely be addressed. And that's because of kind of the merge that I'm seeing between both AI as well as ZK-TLS and self-sovereign identity systems that you can do. That's my take. I don't think it's going to solve everything. I think the last part of that too is a big push is also from a government side, right, of digital identities that are created by governments. Like the most successful identity system so far, you might say, is in India, right, because of Aadhaar. So any of those types of initiatives accelerates this type of kind of connectivity much faster. And so the next 3 to 5 years, I think there'll be a lot of progress. Will all problems be solved? No.
Yeah, to give a more practical kind of case based on our targets internally, currently we do mostly enterprise onboarding because we work directly with enterprises. Enterprise onboarding at Paxos takes about, I'd say on average, 7 days today. By the end of the year, we're trying to reduce that to within 48 hours, ideally 24. So that gives you an idea where we're trying to get to by the end of this year. Ideally, we can get it with between 6 to 12 in the year after. And then in terms of automation, we're automating a lot of things around things like yield pass-through on stable coins and things of that nature on-chain. And those improvements are going to come within the scope of this or next quarter. So things that would usually take direct KYC with users that would take them, call it minutes to hours to get approval, will happen in the time of seconds. So that could give a little bit of a benchmark of kind of where we're going in the next 12 months, at least internally on some of the work streams we're working on.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you, each one of you. I could go on and on and on about my pain points about this all day long, but we need to give up the space. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much as well.